Hi, I'm Emma, and yes, my own sister stood up at Uncle Paul's will reading and called me greedy for wanting a single dollar. One measly dollar. She laughed right there in front of the lawyer, the notary, and half our extended family, saying I was so desperate I'd fight over pocket change. But what Ashley didn't know was that Uncle Paul had sealed away a second part of his will, and when the notary finally opened it, the room went dead silent. Because that $1 wasn't the real inheritance. It was just the key to unlock something worth $2.8 million. A private island. Stick around, because what happened next didn't just humble my sister. It completely flipped everything our family thought they knew about Uncle Paul, about me, and about who really mattered to him in the end. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The thing about being the family disappointment is that you get used to sitting in the back row of your own life. That's where I was 3 weeks ago, folding returned books at the Phoenix Public Library where I work, when my phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. Uncle Paul died. Funeral Tuesday. Will reading Thursday at 2 p.m. Try to look presentable. No. Sorry for your loss, no, are you okay? Just instructions delivered like I was an employee she barely tolerated. Classic Ashley. I set my phone down and stared at the stack of romance novels in front of me, their bright covers suddenly blurring as tears I didn't expect started forming. Uncle Paul was gone. The one person in our family who never made me feel like I needed to apologize for existing, who actually listened when I talked about books and traveling, and all the things Ashley called my unrealistic fantasies. He was the only one who understood why I chose library science over business school, why I drove my 10-year-old Honda instead of financing something flashy, why I was perfectly content in my small one-bedroom apartment with its tiny balcony overlooking a desert garden. Uncle Paul had built his shipping business from absolutely nothing, starting with a single cargo route between California and Mexico back in the 80s. By the time I was old enough to really know him, he owned 3 vessels and had expanded throughout Central America. But despite his success, he never acted like money made him better than anyone else. He'd show up to family barbecues in his faded jeans and polo shirts, listening more than talking, always asking me about whatever book I was reading or whether I'd seen any good documentaries about marine life lately. Ashley, on the other hand, had been groomed since childhood to be the golden daughter. 4 years older than me, she'd landed her real estate license straight out of college and married Kevin, a finance executive with perfectly styled hair and a laugh that sounded like it came from a corporate training video. They lived in a sprawling house in Scottsdale with granite countertops and a 3-car garage, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a home decor magazine but felt about as warm as a dentist's office. The funeral was exactly what I expected. Ashley had coordinated everything down to the flower arrangements, which were massive and expensive, and somehow managed to feel impersonal, despite their beauty. She stood at the front of the chapel in a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, accepting condolences with the perfect balance of grief and composure. Meanwhile, I sat 3 rows back in my simple black cardigan and flats, holding the hand of Aunt Linda, Uncle Paul's sister, who kept whispering stories about their childhood that made me smile despite everything. After the service, people milled around sharing memories, and I noticed something interesting. All of Ashley's stories about Uncle Paul involved his business success, or the expensive gifts he'd given her over the years. The new car when she graduated college, the down payment help when she bought her first house, the family vacations to Hawaii and Europe that I somehow never got invited to. But the older relatives, the ones who'd known Paul before he made his fortune, talked about different things. His kindness, his curiosity about the world, the way he'd spend hours helping neighbors fix their boats or teaching kids how to tie sailing knots. Mrs. Patterson, Uncle Paul's housekeeper for the past 15 years, pulled me aside as people were leaving. She was a tiny Filipino woman with silver hair and eyes that always seemed to be smiling, even today. "Miss Emma," she said quietly, "your uncle, he talked about you all the time. Always asking when you visited last, showing me pictures from your college graduation, telling me about the books you recommended to him." She squeezed my hand. "You were very special to him. I hope you know that." I thanked her, but honestly, I wasn't sure I believed it. If I was so special to Uncle Paul, why had I learned about his death through Ashley's cold text message? Why was I always the last to know about family events, the afterthought invited out of obligation, rather than genuine desire for my company? The will reading was scheduled for the following Thursday at David Collins' law office in Tempe. I'd met David a few times at family gatherings, a pleasant man in his 50s with graying temples and the kind of calm demeanor that probably served him well in his profession. His office was in one of those modern glass buildings that reflected the desert sky, all clean lines and professional landscaping that looked beautiful but required constant irrigation to survive in Arizona's climate. I arrived exactly on time because being punctual was one of the few family expectations I could actually meet without spending money I didn't have. The parking lot was already full of familiar cars, including Ashley's pristine white BMW and Kevin's silver Mercedes. I pulled my Honda into a spot near the back, next to a dusty pickup truck that probably belonged to one of the construction workers renovating the building next door, and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and I was wearing a navy blue dress I'd bought at Target 2 years ago for job interviews. It was clean and appropriate, but standing next to Ashley's designer wardrobe, I probably looked like I was dressed for church instead of a legal proceeding. Not that it mattered. I'd learned long ago that no amount of effort would make me fit into Ashley's version of what success looked like. The elevator carried me to the 3rd floor, where David's receptionist directed me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the desert landscape. Ashley was already seated at the large mahogany table, flanked by Kevin and their 16-year-old son Jake, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Aunt Linda sat across from them, quietly sipping water from a crystal glass, and a few distant cousins I barely knew occupied chairs near the back of the room. Ashley looked up when I entered, her perfectly applied makeup creating sharp lines around her eyes as she smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't really meant to be friendly. "Well, look who decided to show up," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I wasn't sure you'd make the effort, Em. I know how busy you are with your books." The way she said books made it sound like a character flaw, like my job was some kind of elaborate hobby rather than a legitimate career. I took a seat near Aunt Linda, who patted my arm reassuringly and waited for David to begin. David entered carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression that probably came with years of delivering difficult news to grieving families. Behind him walked a woman I didn't recognize, a Latina woman in her 40s with short black hair and a professional bearing that suggested she took her job very seriously. "Thank you all for coming," David said, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "I know this is a difficult time, and I'll do my best to make this process as straightforward as possible. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce Rebecca Torres, a certified notary public who will be witnessing today's proceedings per the specific instructions in Paul's will." Rebecca nodded politely at the room, then took a seat near David with a small recording device and a stack of official-looking documents. Something about her presence felt more formal than I'd expected, like Uncle Paul had anticipated complications that the rest of us couldn't see coming. David opened his briefcase with deliberate care and withdrew a thick document bound in navy blue covers. "Paul's will is quite comprehensive," he explained, "but he's divided it into 2 distinct sections. The first covers his primary assets and bequests, which I'll read now. The second section contains what he called additional bequests, and per his explicit instructions, that portion will only be opened and read if certain conditions are met." Ashley leaned forward slightly, her manicured fingers drumming against the table's polished surface. I could practically see her calculating figures in her head, probably trying to estimate the value of Uncle Paul's house and business assets. She'd always been good with numbers, a skill that had served her well in real estate, but also made her view most of life's experiences through the lens of their monetary worth. "Let's begin," David said, clearing his throat. "I, Paul Michael Rodriguez, being of sound mind and body, do hereby distribute my worldly possessions as follows." He paused, looking around the room. "To my sister Linda Rodriguez, I leave my collection of maritime artifacts and the sum of $25,000, in recognition of her constant support and her understanding of my love for the sea. Aunt Linda's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled softly. Uncle Paul had always brought her shells and driftwood from his travels, and his house was filled with nautical decorations that told the story of his journeys. To my great-nephew Jake Rodriguez, David continued, I leave my vintage coin collection and $10,000, to be held in trust until his 18th birthday, in hopes that he'll develop an appreciation for history and the stories that objects can tell. Jake straightened up in his chair, probably the first time he'd shown genuine interest in anything family-related in months. David read through several more smaller bequests to longtime employees and distant relatives, then reached the section that made Ashley sit up straighter. To my niece Ashley Rodriguez Murphy, I leave my primary residence at 2847 Desert Willow Drive in Tempe, Arizona, along with all furnishings and contents, plus the sum of $100,000, and my remaining business interests in Rodriguez Shipping International. Ashley's face broke into a satisfied smile, the kind of expression that said she'd been expecting exactly this outcome. The house alone was worth at least $400,000, and the business interests were probably worth significantly more. Kevin reached over and squeezed her hand, and I could see them already making plans for how they'd use the windfall. Then David's voice continued, and the room's energy shifted completely. To my niece Emma Rodriguez, he read, his tone becoming somehow more deliberate. I leave the sum of $1, to be presented in cash at the time of this reading. The silence that followed was deafening. Ashley's smile froze, then slowly transformed into something closer to confusion mixed with amusement. A few of the cousins exchanged glances, and I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment that started at my neck and spread upward like spilled wine. David reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small white envelope, which he slid across the table toward me. I stared at it for a moment, unable to process what had just happened. Uncle Paul, the one person who I thought understood me, who valued our conversations about books and travel and life's deeper meanings, had left me a single dollar. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ashley couldn't contain herself. She let out a laugh that started as a snort and grew into something louder and more cutting. $1? She said, her voice rising. Paul left Emma one whole dollar? She turned to address the room like she was hosting a comedy show. I mean, I knew Paul had a sense of humor, but this is incredible. Em, are you really going to fight for that? Are you actually going to sit there and demand your dollar? The laughter that followed wasn't malicious from everyone, more nervous and uncomfortable, but it felt like being slapped across the face in front of strangers. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the leather chair, and never have to make eye contact with anyone in that room again. But something in David's expression stopped me from running. He was watching me carefully, his eyes holding a kind of patient expectation that suggested this moment was important, in ways I didn't understand yet. Actually, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt, yes, I'll take my dollar. Ashley laughed even harder. Oh my God, Em, you're actually going to take it. You're so desperate that you're going to pocket Uncle Paul's joke money and pretend it means something. I reached for the envelope, my hands trembling slightly, and opened it. Inside was a crisp $1 bill, folded neatly in half. But there was something else too. A small piece of paper with Uncle Paul's handwriting that read, "The greatest treasures are often hidden in plain sight. Thank you for seeing me, Emma. The rest of your inheritance awaits." My heart started beating faster, but I kept my expression neutral. Ashley was still making comments about my desperation, and Kevin was chuckling along with her performance, but I noticed that David and Rebecca were watching me with increased attention. Is there something else? I asked David directly. Ashley's laughter cut off abruptly. What do you mean, something else? You got your dollar, Em. That's your inheritance. Uncle Paul's final joke, at your expense. But David was already reaching for a second document, this one sealed in an envelope with maritime-themed wax seal that bore the image of an anchor. Actually, he said, his voice carrying new weight, Paul's instructions were very specific. The second section of his will is only to be opened and read if Emma Rodriguez is present at this reading and chooses to claim her initial bequest. The room went completely silent. Ashley's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by something that looked like confusion mixed with growing alarm. Rebecca leaned forward, her notary stamp ready. Per the deceased's explicit written instructions, I am now required to break the seal on the supplementary will and read its contents aloud to all present parties. David carefully broke the wax seal and unfolded what appeared to be several pages of legal documents. His eyes scanned the first page, and I watched his eyebrows rise slightly before he composed himself and began to read. Supplementary bequest to Emma Rodriguez, he announced, his voice now carrying the kind of gravity reserved for life-changing moments. In addition to the symbolic dollar representing the value I place on material possessions compared to human connection, I hereby bequeath to my niece, Emma Rodriguez, the property known as Isla Esperanza, a 12-acre private island located off the coast of Belize, including all structures, furnishings, and improvements thereon. Ashley's face went completely white. Kevin's mouth actually fell open. The cousins in the back of the room started whispering frantically to each other. But David wasn't finished. Also included in this bequest is a maintenance fund of $50,000 annually to be administered through the First National Trust of Phoenix, ensuring the property's upkeep regardless of Emma's residency status. The current assessed value of Isla Esperanza, as appraised in March of this year, is $2.8 million. The silence that followed was different from the earlier embarrassment. This was the silence of shock, of minds trying to recalibrate reality, of assumptions crumbling in real time. Ashley found her voice first, though it came out as more of a croak. That's impossible. Paul never owned an island. I would have known about it. I handled his tax documents for the business. Rebecca spoke up, her professional demeanor unwavering. Ma'am, I have copies of the property deed, insurance documents, and tax records dating back 15 years. The island was purchased by Paul Rodriguez in 2009 and has been maintained through a property management company in Belize City ever since. But why? Ashley's voice was getting higher, more desperate. Why would he hide this? Why wouldn't he tell us about it? David consulted the documents again. There's actually a letter explaining his reasoning. Would you like me to read it? I nodded, still too stunned to speak. $2.8 million. A private island. My Uncle Paul, who I thought had forgotten about me, had left me something worth more than Ashley's entire inheritance combined. David unfolded a handwritten letter. Uncle Paul's familiar script covering several pages in blue ink. My dear Emma, he began reading. If you're hearing this, it means you claimed your dollar, despite what I'm sure was significant mockery from certain family members. That tells me everything I need to know about your character, just as it always has. Ashley made a sound like she was choking. You see, Emma, I've been watching our family dynamics for decades, and I've noticed something troubling. Success and kindness have become opposites in our household. The more financially successful someone becomes, the less they seem to value the simple human decencies that make life worth living. You, my dear niece, have remained kind despite having every reason to become bitter. The words hit me like warm sunlight after a long winter. Uncle Paul had been watching. He had noticed. David continued reading. While Ashley visited me to discuss business opportunities and potential inheritances, you visited to ask about my health and share stories about the books you'd discovered. While others saw my shipping company as their future security, you saw me as a person worth spending time with. When I was in the hospital last year with pneumonia, you were the only family member who called every day, not to ask about my will or my assets, but to make sure I wasn't lonely. I remembered those phone calls. Uncle Paul had sounded so tired, so isolated, and I just wanted him to know someone cared whether he felt better. Isla Esperanza has been my retreat for 15 years, David read on. I bought it when the shipping business first became profitable, not as an investment, but as a place where I could remember who I was before money complicated everything. The island has a small villa with a library containing some of my most treasured books, many of which you recommended to me over the years. It has solar power, fresh water from a natural spring, and a dock where I've spent countless hours watching sunsets and thinking about what really matters in life. Ashley was staring at the table, her hands clenched into fists. Emma, you can live on the island, visit occasionally, or sell it entirely. The choice is yours, and I trust your judgment completely. The annual maintenance fund ensures that whatever you decide, the property will be cared for by Maria and Carlos, the wonderful Belizean family who have been the island's caretakers since I purchased it. They've become dear friends, and I hope you'll enjoy their company as much as I have. David looked up from the letter. The letter continues with specific details about accessing the property, contact information for the caretakers and the property management company, and instructions for the trust fund administration. There are also keys to the island's villa and a detailed map of the property. He reached into an envelope and withdrew a set of brass keys attached to a small wooden keychain carved in the shape of a sea turtle. Emma, these are yours. I took the keys with shaking hands, their weight somehow feeling both substantial and surreal. This was really happening. Uncle Paul hadn't forgotten about me. He hadn't seen me as a disappointment or a charity case. He'd seen me as worthy of his most precious possession. Ashley's voice cut through my amazement like a knife. "This is fraud," she said, standing up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. Paul was sick at the end. He wasn't thinking clearly. There's no way he would have hidden something this valuable from the family. Rebecca cleared her throat. "Ma'am, I have documentation showing that Mr. Rodriguez updated this will 6 months ago, when he was in perfect health. The psychological evaluation required for bequests of this magnitude shows complete mental competency. Additionally, the original will creating this trust was written and notarized 15 years ago, shortly after the island purchase." 15 years? Ashley's voice cracked. "He's been planning this for 15 years? David nodded gravely. The letter indicates that Paul has been observing family dynamics for quite some time, and that Emma's consistent kindness and genuine interest in his well-being, rather than his wealth, convinced him that she would appreciate the island's true value. Ashley turned on me, her composure completely shattered. "You manipulated him. You played the poor, struggling niece to make him feel guilty. You made him think the rest of us were only interested in his money." The accusation stung because part of me wondered if it might be true. Had I unconsciously manipulated Uncle Paul's affections? Had my genuine care for him been tainted by some subconscious hope for reward? But then I remembered the phone calls during his illness, how I'd worried about him being alone and scared. I remembered helping him organize his book collection, not because he asked me to, but because I could see it brought him joy to talk about the stories he'd loved. I remembered listening to his travel stories not because I wanted something from him, but because his adventures fascinated me and his enthusiasm was infectious. "I never asked him for anything," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "I visited him because I loved him, not because I wanted his money. I didn't even know this island existed until 5 minutes ago." Aunt Linda spoke up for the first time since the reading began. "That's exactly why he left it to you, sweetheart. Paul always said the best gifts go to people who don't expect them." Ashley whirled around to face her aunt. "You knew about this?" Aunt Linda shook her head. "I didn't know about the island specifically, but I knew Paul was troubled by what he saw as the family's increasing focus on material success over personal relationships. He mentioned several times how much he enjoyed Emma's visits, how she was the only one who seemed interested in him as a person rather than as a potential benefactor." "That's not true," Ashley protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "I cared about Paul. I helped him with his business affairs. I made sure he had proper medical care." "You hired accountants and lawyers," Aunt Linda replied gently. Emma sat with him and listened to his stories. The truth of that statement settled over the room like dust after a windstorm. Ashley had indeed been involved in Uncle Paul's life, but always in a managerial capacity, always focused on efficiency and outcomes, rather than connection and understanding. David cleared his throat diplomatically. "I think we've covered all the essential information. Emma, you'll need to sign several documents to complete the transfer. And I have contact information for the property management company in Belize. They can arrange transportation to the island whenever you're ready to visit. I nodded, still feeling like this was all happening to someone else. Can I ask you something? Did Uncle Paul ever visit the island recently? According to the property managers, he spent 2 weeks there every winter for the past decade. His last visit was in January, just 3 months before he passed away. They said he spent most of his time reading in the library and watching the sunset from the villa's deck. The image of Uncle Paul sitting alone on his island, surrounded by books and natural beauty, made my chest tighten with emotion. He'd found his own private paradise, and now he was sharing it with me. Ashley gathered her purse and stood up, her movements sharp and angry. "This isn't over," she said, though she was looking at me rather than David. "I'm going to contest this. No court is going to believe that Paul intended to give a private island to someone who makes $30,000 a year shelving books." Kevin finally spoke up, his voice uncertain. "Ashley, maybe we should think about this. If the documentation is legitimate." "It's not legitimate," Ashley snapped. "It can't be. People don't just hide multi-million-dollar assets for 15 years. There has to be some kind of mistake or fraud or something." But even as she said it, I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. Deep down, she knew Uncle Paul well enough to recognize that this was exactly the kind of thing he might do. He'd always been unconventional, always more interested in meaningful gestures than practical ones. Rebecca began packing up her notary supplies. "Mrs. Murphy, if you choose to contest the will, that's certainly your right. However, I should mention that the documentation I've witnessed today is extremely thorough. Mr. Rodriguez worked with 3 different law firms over the past 15 years to ensure this bequest would be legally unassailable. 3 law firms. 15 years of planning." Uncle Paul had really thought this through. As people began filing out of the conference room, I remained seated, staring at the keys in my palm. The brass was warm from my touch, and the little sea turtle keychain caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Aunt Linda paused beside my chair. "Emma, honey, I hope you know how proud Paul would be right now, not because of the money or the property, but because of who you are. That's what he was really leaving you, you know. Confirmation that your kindness and authenticity matter more than anything else." After everyone else had left, David and I spent another hour going through the practical details. There were bank accounts to establish, insurance policies to transfer, and coordination required with the property management company in Belize. But the most important document was Uncle Paul's detailed letter explaining not just what he was giving me but why. "Emma has always possessed the qualities I most admire in people," one section read. "Curiosity without greed, ambition without cruelty, intelligence without arrogance. She represents the kind of person I wish I had been before. Success convinced me that wealth was a measure of worth. In giving her Isa Speranza, I'm not making her rich. I'm giving her the freedom to be herself without apology." By the time I walked out of David's office, the Arizona sun was beginning to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the travel documentaries Uncle Paul used to love. I sat in my Honda for several minutes, keys to a private island resting on the passenger seat next to my everyday car keys, and my library employee ID badge. My phone buzzed with text messages from Ashley, starting with, "We need to talk," and escalating to, "You can't possibly think you deserve this," and finally, "I'm calling a lawyer first thing Monday morning." I turned off my phone without responding. For the first time in my life, Ashley's opinion of my choices didn't matter to me at all. The drive home took me through the familiar streets of Phoenix, past the shopping centers and chain restaurants and housing developments that made up my everyday world. But somehow everything looked different now, like I was seeing it through new eyes. I wasn't just Emma Rodriguez, the struggling librarian who never quite lived up to her family's expectations. I was Emma Rodriguez, owner of a private island, inheritor of a legacy built on kindness rather than ambition. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, Mrs. Chen from next door was watering the small desert garden she'd planted between our buildings. She waved, and I found myself walking over to tell her about Uncle Paul's passing. Mrs. Chen had always been kind to me, often sharing vegetables from her garden and asking about my work at the library. I'm so sorry for your loss, dear, she said, setting down her watering can. Your uncle sounded like a wonderful man from the stories you've told me. He was, I replied, thinking about the letter David had read. He was the kind of person who saw the best in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves. As I climbed the stairs to my second-floor apartment, I realized that Uncle Paul's greatest gift wasn't the island or the money, or even the vindication of being chosen over Ashley. His greatest gift was showing me that I was already enough, exactly as I was, without changing or apologizing or trying to become someone else's version of successful. Inside my small apartment, I made a cup of tea and sat on my tiny balcony, watching the last light fade from the desert sky. Tomorrow I would start figuring out the practical details of my inheritance. I would call the property managers in Belize, research travel requirements, and begin to understand what owning a private island actually meant. But tonight I just wanted to sit quietly and think about Uncle Paul, alone on his island with his books and his sunsets, planning this moment for 15 years. He'd seen something in me that I'd never seen in myself, and now, finally, I was beginning to see it too. The week following the will reading felt like living in a parallel universe where everything looked the same but operated by completely different rules. I still drove the same route to work each morning, still organized returned books and helped patrons find research materials, still heated up frozen dinners in my small kitchen each evening. But underneath the surface of my ordinary routine, everything had fundamentally shifted. I hadn't told anyone at work about the inheritance yet. How do you casually mention to your coworkers that you've inherited a private island worth nearly $3 million? The whole situation felt so surreal that part of me wondered if I'd imagined the entire will reading, if I'd somehow misunderstood what David Collins had said in that conference room. But the keys were real, sitting in a small wooden box on my kitchen counter next to Uncle Paul's letter, which I'd read so many times I could recite portions from memory. The business card for Coastal Properties Belize was real too, along with the thick folder of documents David had given me containing property deeds, insurance policies, and detailed photographs of Isla Esperanza that made my heart race every time I looked at them. The island was even more beautiful than I'd imagined. The aerial photos showed a crescent-shaped piece of land covered in lush tropical vegetation, surrounded by water so clear and blue it looked like something from a travel magazine. The villa sat on a slight rise overlooking the water, its white walls and red tile roof giving it a Mediterranean feel, despite its Caribbean location. There was a long wooden dock extending into deeper water, perfect for boats, and what appeared to be a smaller guest cottage, nestled among palm trees near the shore. But the photograph that took my breath away showed the library Uncle Paul had mentioned in his letter. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the ocean, and built-in bookshelves lined every wall, filled with hundreds of volumes. I could see comfortable reading chairs positioned to catch the natural light, and a writing desk placed perfectly to take advantage of the view. It was exactly the kind of space I'd dreamed about during all those years of working in cramped library storage rooms and windowless back offices. Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after the will reading, my phone rang just as I was settling down with a cup of chamomile tea and a mystery novel I'd been meaning to finish. Ashley's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. We hadn't spoken since she'd stormed out of David's office, though she'd sent several increasingly frantic text messages that I'd read but not answered. Against my better judgment, I picked up. "Emma, we need to talk." Ashley's voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "This whole situation with Uncle Paul's will, it's gotten completely out of hand." I set down my tea carefully, preparing myself for whatever approach she'd decided to take. "What do you mean, Ashley?" "I mean this fantasy about a private island and millions of dollars. I've been doing research, Em, and the whole thing doesn't make sense. Uncle Paul's tax records show legitimate business income, but nothing that would support purchasing and maintaining a multi-million-dollar property in another country. I think someone's been lying to you." The certainty in her voice almost made me doubt myself, until I remembered the thick folder of documentation sitting on my kitchen table. "Ashley, David Collins showed us all the paperwork. Property deeds, insurance policies, maintenance records going back 15 years. Papers can be forged, she said quickly. Think about it logically. You worked at a library. You understand how research works. Have you actually verified any of this information independently? Have you called this supposed property management company? Have you checked whether Isla Esperanza actually exists? Her questions hit their mark because, honestly, I hadn't done any independent verification yet. The whole situation had been so overwhelming that I'd simply accepted David's documentation at face value. Maybe Ashley was right to be suspicious. Maybe I was being naive to believe that Uncle Paul had secretly owned a tropical paradise for 15 years, without anyone in the family knowing about it. I'm planning to call the property company tomorrow, I said, though until that moment I hadn't committed to any specific timeline. Emma, listen to me. I'm your sister, and despite our differences, I don't want to see you get hurt. Someone is taking advantage of you, probably using your grief over Uncle Paul to manipulate you into believing something that sounds too good to be true. Because it is too good to be true. Ashley's tone had shifted to something that sounded almost like concern, and for a moment I felt the old familiar pull of wanting her approval, wanting to believe that she genuinely cared about my well-being rather than just her own interests. What do you think I should do? I asked. Come over this weekend. Bring all the paperwork David gave you, and let Kevin look at it. He deals with complex financial documents all the time, and he knows how to spot irregularities. We'll figure this out together, as a family. The offer sounded reasonable, almost generous, but something in Ashley's voice made me hesitate. There was an undertone of urgency that suggested this wasn't entirely about protecting me from fraud. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I think I'd rather handle this myself for now. I'll call the property company tomorrow and start verifying the information independently. Ashley's concerned tone evaporated instantly. Fine, do whatever you want, Emma, but don't come crying to me when you realize you've been played for a fool. And don't expect the family to support you when this whole house of cards comes crashing down. She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone and wondering whether I was being prudent or paranoid. Ashley had always been better at practical matters than I was. She understood finance and real estate and legal complexities that often left me feeling overwhelmed. Maybe she was right to be skeptical about Uncle Paul's bequest, but then I thought about the letter, about Uncle Paul's detailed explanations of why he'd chosen to leave me the island, about the specific memories he'd referenced that only someone who'd been paying close attention to our relationship would have known. Would someone trying to defraud me really have gone to such elaborate lengths to create emotional authenticity? Friday morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day researching everything I could find about Isla Esperanza and Coastal Properties Belize. What I discovered both amazed and vindicated me. The property management company had an extensive website with photographs and detailed descriptions of dozens of private islands throughout the Caribbean. Isla Esperanza was featured prominently in their luxury properties section, with the listing showing Uncle Paul's full name as the owner and including many of the same photographs David had shown me. The company's credentials checked out completely, with business licenses, Better Business Bureau ratings, and testimonials from other wealthy property owners. More importantly, I found several travel blog posts and magazine articles from the past decade that mentioned Isla Esperanza specifically. A 2019 article in Caribbean Travel Monthly featured an interview with Maria Santos, the island's caretaker, discussing sustainable living practices on private islands. She mentioned working for, quote, a kind American businessman who visits every winter and has created a haven for both marine life and book lovers. That detail about book lovers convinced me more than any legal document could have. Uncle Paul had shared his passion for reading with the island's caretakers, just as he'd shared it with me. I also discovered that Belize was actually a popular destination for wealthy Americans seeking private island ownership, with relatively straightforward laws regarding foreign property investment and a stable political environment that made such purchases practical rather than exotic. By Friday evening, I was confident that Ashley's concerns about fraud were unfounded, but her phone call had served one useful purpose by forcing me to confront the question of what I actually wanted to do with my inheritance. The smart financial move would probably be to sell the island immediately and invest the proceeds conservatively. Nearly $3 million could provide financial security for the rest of my life if I managed it properly. I could quit my job at the library, go back to school, travel, maybe even buy a small house in a neighborhood where I wouldn't feel like the poorest person on the block. But every time I looked at the photographs of the villa's library, with its wall of books and ocean view, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just desire, but recognition. Like I was looking at a place where I belonged, where my love of solitude and reading and natural beauty wouldn't be seen as character flaws but as perfectly reasonable ways to spend one's time. Saturday morning, I called Coastal Properties Belize. The phone rang several times before a warm voice with a slight Caribbean accent answered. Coastal Properties, this is Marcus speaking. How may I help you? Hi, my name is Emma Rodriguez. I believe you manage a property called Isla Esperanza that belonged to my uncle, Paul Rodriguez? There was a brief pause. Then Marcus's voice became noticeably more excited. Miss Emma, oh my goodness, we've been expecting your call. Maria Santos, she told me just yesterday that Mr. Paul spoke of you often during his visits. I'm so sorry for your loss, miss. Your uncle was a truly wonderful man. The genuine warmth in Marcus's voice made my eyes fill with unexpected tears. Thank you. I'm still trying to understand everything about the island and how it all works. Of course, miss. It's quite a responsibility, inheriting such a property. Would you like me to explain how we've been managing things for Mr. Paul? Or do you have specific questions? For the next hour, Marcus walked me through every detail of the island's operation. The solar power system that Uncle Paul had installed 5 years ago, making the property completely energy independent. The natural freshwater spring that provided clean drinking water year-round. The small organic garden that Maria tended, growing tropical fruits and vegetables. The communication system that allowed internet and phone access despite the remote location. Most importantly, he told me about Maria and Carlos Santos, the Belizean couple who'd been living on the island as caretakers for the past 8 years. They were both in their 50s, with grown children living in Belize City, and they'd become deeply attached to Isla Esperanza and to Uncle Paul personally. Mr. Paul, he was like family to them, Marcus explained. Every year when he came for his winter visit, they would plan special meals and take him to their favorite fishing spots. Maria always said he was the kindest employer she'd ever had, always asking about their health and their children, always bringing gifts from the United States. Are they worried about what will happen now that the island has a new owner? I asked. Well, miss, they're hopeful that you'll be as kind as your uncle was. Mr. Paul told them many stories about you, about how you love books and nature and peaceful places. Maria, she's very excited about the possibility of meeting you. She said the island's library needs someone who truly appreciates books to bring it back to life. The idea of meeting Maria and Carlos, of seeing Uncle Paul's island through their eyes, suddenly became intensely appealing. Marcus, if I wanted to visit the island, how would that work? Very simple, miss. We arranged transportation from Belize City to the island by boat, about a 2-hour journey through some of the most beautiful waters in the Caribbean. You can stay as long as you like. The villa is fully equipped and Maria keeps it ready for guests at all times. Would you like me to begin making arrangements? I found myself saying yes before I'd consciously made the decision. Something about Marcus's descriptions of Uncle Paul's relationship with the island and its caretakers made me desperate to see it for myself. To understand what had captured my uncle's heart so completely that he'd kept it secret from his entire family for 15 years. I'd like to come as soon as possible, I said. Maybe next weekend? Wonderful. I'll coordinate with Maria and arrange the boat transport. You'll fly into Belize City, and we'll have you on the island by Saturday afternoon. Miss Emma, I think you're going to love Isla Esperanza as much as your uncle did. After hanging up with Marcus, I sat in my small living room, looking around at my simple furniture and modest belongings, trying to imagine what my life might look like if I actually decided to spend significant time on a private island in Belize. It seemed impossible that someone like me, someone who clipped grocery store coupons and bought clothes at discount stores, could suddenly have access to the kind of luxury that most people only saw in movies. But Uncle Paul had been an ordinary person too, before he built his shipping business. He'd grown up in the same modest Phoenix neighborhood where Aunt Linda still lived, attended public schools, worked his way through college. His success hadn't changed his fundamental character, which was probably why he'd been able to see past my financial struggles to whatever qualities had impressed him enough to leave me his most treasured possession. That evening, I called Aunt Linda to tell her about my conversation with the property management company and my plans to visit the island. "Oh, Emma, how exciting," she said. "Paul would be absolutely thrilled to know you're going to see his special place. He used to show me pictures sometimes, though he swore me to secrecy about it. He was so proud of that little piece of paradise he'd created." "Did he ever tell you why he kept it secret from the rest of the family?" Aunt Linda was quiet for a moment. "I think Paul was afraid that if Ashley and Kevin knew about the island, they'd start pressuring him to sell it or develop it into something commercial. You know how they are about maximizing investments and financial opportunities. Paul saw the island as his sanctuary, not as a business asset." That explanation made perfect sense, and it also explained why Uncle Paul had been so specific in his will about giving me complete control over the property's future. He'd trusted me to understand the island's value in terms that went beyond dollars and cents. Sunday afternoon, Ashley called again. "Emma, Kevin looked up this coastal properties company online, and he found some concerning information. There are complaints filed against them with international business bureaus, and their financial records show some irregularities that suggest they might not be entirely legitimate." I felt a familiar flutter of self-doubt, even though I'd spent hours researching the company myself, and found nothing but positive reviews and proper credentials. "What kind of complaints, Ashley? Overcharging for services, poor maintenance of properties, even some allegations of fraudulent billing. Kevin thinks they might be running some kind of elaborate scam targeting wealthy Americans who can't easily verify what's happening with their overseas properties. Did Kevin actually see these complaints himself, or are you just telling me what he told you?" Ashley's tone became defensive. "Are you accusing my husband of lying to you? I'm just trying to understand where this information is coming from. When I researched the company, I found excellent reviews and proper business licenses." "Well, maybe you didn't look hard enough. Maybe you found what you wanted to find, because the alternative is admitting that you're not actually inheriting millions of dollars." Ashley's accusations stung, because it contained just enough truth to be unsettling. Did I want to believe in the island inheritance so desperately that I was ignoring potential red flags? Was I being naive about the whole situation? But then I remembered Marcus's voice on the phone, the genuine warmth when he'd talked about Uncle Paul and the excitement when he described Maria's garden and the island's library. Either Marcus was an incredibly talented con artist, or he was exactly what he appeared to be, someone who genuinely cared about the property he managed and the people who owned it. "Ashley, I appreciate your concern, but I've already made arrangements to visit the island next weekend. If it's a scam, I'll find out quickly enough." "You're going to Belize?" "Emma, that's incredibly dangerous. You don't know anything about this company or these people. What if they're planning to rob you or worse?" "I'll be fine. I'm not carrying large amounts of cash, and I'll be in constant communication with people here in the United States." "This is insane. You're risking your safety chasing after some fantasy that Uncle Paul would never have kept secret from his family for 15 years. Ashley's voice was getting higher and more frantic, and I realized that beneath her concern about my safety was a deeper fear about what my inheritance meant for her own sense of status within the family. She'd always been the successful sister, the one who made smart financial decisions and lived the kind of life that impressed our relatives. If I suddenly owned a multi-million-dollar property, the family dynamics that had defined our entire relationship would be completely upended. "Ashley, I understand this is difficult for you, but Uncle Paul made his decision about how to distribute his assets. We both have to accept his choices and move forward." "His choices?" "Emma, if this island actually exists, if Uncle Paul really owned it, then he lied to his entire family for 15 years. He let us believe that his business and his house in Tempe represented his entire estate while secretly owning property worth more than everything else combined. Don't you find that disturbing?" I considered her point. Uncle Paul had indeed kept a significant secret from his family, and that did seem out of character for someone who'd always appeared to value honesty and straightforward communication. But then I thought about family dinners over the years. about the way Ashley and Kevin had always steered conversations toward business opportunities and investment strategies, about their obvious interest in Uncle Paul's financial affairs. Maybe he'd kept the island secret not because he was deceptive by nature, but because he'd recognized that certain family members viewed his success primarily as an opportunity for their own advancement. Maybe Uncle Paul kept the island private because he wanted one part of his life that wasn't subject to other people's opinions about how he should manage his money, I said. Ashley was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. Emma, I want you to know that if this inheritance turns out to be real, if you actually end up owning a valuable property, I think we should discuss how to handle it responsibly. This kind of wealth comes with obligations to family, and I hope you'll consider sharing the benefits rather than keeping everything for yourself. There it was, the real reason behind Ashley's concerns about fraud and safety. She wasn't worried about me being scammed. She was worried about being excluded from a windfall she felt entitled to share. Ashley, Uncle Paul had 15 years to consider how he wanted to distribute his assets. He made his decision deliberately, and I think we need to respect that. So you're going to keep millions of dollars while your sister struggles with mortgage payments and college expenses for Jake? The question revealed so much about Ashley's perspective on money and family obligations. She genuinely believed that Uncle Paul's bequest to me was somehow unfair to her, despite the fact that she'd inherited property and money worth several $100,000. Ashley, you're not struggling. You live in a beautiful house in Scottsdale, you have a successful career, and Jake will have access to excellent educational opportunities. Uncle Paul left you a substantial inheritance, and he left me something that he thought I would appreciate for reasons that had nothing to do with its monetary value. You can't possibly be naive enough to think this is about anything other than money, Emma. Private islands don't have sentimental value, they have market value. And if you inherit something worth nearly $3 million while I get a house and some business assets worth maybe half that amount, then Uncle Paul essentially decided that you deserve more than I do. Ashley's math was wrong, actually. Her inheritance was probably worth close to what mine was, especially considering the ongoing value of Uncle Paul's business interests. But I didn't bother correcting her because I was beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't really about fairness or family obligations. Ashley was struggling with the possibility that Uncle Paul had valued our relationship more than his relationship with her. She was confronting the uncomfortable realization that all her efforts to position herself as the responsible, successful family member might not have impressed Uncle Paul as much as she'd assumed. Ashley, I'm sorry this situation is painful for you, but I can't change Uncle Paul's decisions. And I can't base my choices about the inheritance on guilt about receiving something you think you deserved instead. Fine, Ashley said, her voice turning cold again. Do whatever you want, Emma. Fly off to your tropical paradise and pretend you're suddenly sophisticated enough to manage a multi-million-dollar property. But don't expect me to bail you out when reality hits and you realize you're in over your head. She hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me feeling drained and confused about whether I was making reasonable decisions or allowing my emotions to cloud my judgment. That night, I pulled out all the documentation David Collins had given me and spread it across my kitchen table, determined to examine every detail with the kind of critical eye Ashley claimed I was lacking. The property deeds were notarized and bore official seals from the Belizean government. The insurance policies were issued by major international companies with sterling reputations. The maintenance records showed consistent, reasonable expenses for utilities, groundskeeping, and property management over a 15-year period. Most convincingly, the photographs and documentation showed a consistent story over time. Pictures from 2009 showed the island in its original, undeveloped state. Photos from subsequent years documented the construction of the villa, the installation of solar panels, the planting of gardens, the building of the dock. Everything suggested a property that had been carefully developed and lovingly maintained over many years, not something hastily constructed to support an elaborate fraud. The morning I was scheduled to fly to Belize, Ashley sent one final text message. Emma, please reconsider this trip. If you're determined to pursue this inheritance, at least hire an independent lawyer to verify everything before you commit to anything. I'm begging you to be careful. Despite everything that had happened between us, I found myself touched by what seemed like genuine concern in her message. Maybe Ashley really was worried about my safety and well-being, even if her motivations were complicated by her own disappointment about Uncle Paul's will. I texted back, "Thank you for caring about me. I'll be careful, and I'll call you when I get back to let you know what I found." Ashley responded immediately, "I love you, Em. I just don't want to see you get hurt." For the first time since the will reading, I felt like I was glimpsing the sister I remembered from childhood, the one who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework before success in competition had complicated our relationship. Maybe this whole situation with Uncle Paul's inheritance could eventually lead to something positive between us if we could both get past our initial reactions and find a way to rebuild trust. But first, I needed to see Isla Esperanza for myself. I needed to understand what Uncle Paul had loved about his secret paradise, and I needed to decide whether his vision for my future was something I could embrace, or something I should gratefully decline in favor of a more conventional path. As my plane lifted off from Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, I looked down at the desert landscape where I'd spent my entire life, wondering if I would see it differently when I returned. In less than 24 hours, I would be standing on a private island in the Caribbean, trying to understand how a shy librarian from Arizona had suddenly become the owner of a tropical paradise that most people could only dream about visiting. The flight to Belize City gave me hours to think about what I wanted from this trip and what I was hoping to discover about Uncle Paul's secret world. Part of me was still half convinced that I would arrive to find some kind of elaborate mistake or misunderstanding, that the reality of Isla Esperanza would be far less magical than the photographs and documents had suggested. But another part of me, the part that had always felt slightly out of place in my ordinary life, was desperately hoping that Uncle Paul's gift was everything it appeared to be. For the first time in my adult life, I was about to step into a world where my love of solitude and reading and natural beauty would be assets rather than eccentricities, where I could exist without constantly feeling like I needed to apologize for not being more ambitious or more social or more interested in material success. As the plane began its descent into Belize City, I could see the Caribbean coastline stretching out below me, an endless expanse of blue water dotted with small islands that looked like green jewels scattered across silk. Somewhere out there, if everything I'd been told was true, Uncle Paul's island was waiting for me to discover what he'd seen in both it and me that had convinced him we belonged together. The humid air of Belize City hit me like a warm, wet blanket as I stepped off the plane, carrying nothing but a small duffel bag and the manila folder containing all my island documentation. The airport was smaller and more casual than anything I'd experienced, with ceiling fans turning lazily overhead and tropical plants growing in planters throughout the terminal. Everything smelled like ocean salt, mixed with something floral I couldn't identify. Marcus had arranged for a driver to meet me, and I spotted my name on a handwritten sign held by a middle-aged Belizean man, wearing a bright blue shirt and an enormous smile. "Miss Emma Rodriguez?" he asked as I approached. "I'm Joseph, and I'll be taking you to the marina where Marcus is waiting with the boat." The drive through Belize City revealed a fascinating mix of Caribbean colonial architecture and modern development, with painted wooden houses on stilts sitting alongside concrete block buildings and small businesses, with hand-lettered signs advertising everything from fresh seafood to cell phone repairs. Children played in yards filled with tropical flowers, and I caught glimpses of the ocean through gaps between buildings, reminding me that I was now thousands of miles from the Arizona desert that had been my entire world until yesterday. At the marina, Marcus turned out to be a tall, lean man in his 40s, with sun-weathered skin and laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. He greeted me with the kind of warm handshake that felt genuinely welcoming rather than merely professional. "Miss Emma, such a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Your uncle spoke of you so often during his visits that I feel like I know you already. He always said you had the soul of an explorer trapped in the body of a librarian." That description sounded exactly like something Uncle Paul would say, and hearing it from someone who'd known him in his secret life made my eyes water unexpectedly. "He really talked about me?" "Oh yes, constantly. He'd tell stories about your conversations regarding books and travel, about how you were the only family member who seemed interested in the world beyond your immediate surroundings. He said you had a curiosity about life that reminded him of himself when he was younger, before business responsibilities consumed so much of his attention. Marcus led me to a sleek white boat that looked like it could comfortably handle ocean travel, with a small cabin for shelter and cushioned seating areas both inside and on deck. The vessel was clearly well maintained and equipped with modern navigation equipment, which eased some of my lingering concerns about the safety of traveling to a remote island with people I'd never met before. The journey takes about 2 hours, Marcus explained as we loaded my bag and pulled away from the dock. We'll follow the coastline for the first hour, then head into open water toward Isla Esperanza. The weather is perfect today, so you'll get beautiful views of the reef and the smaller cays as we travel. As we left the harbor and entered the open Caribbean, I understood immediately why Uncle Paul had fallen in love with this part of the world. The water was the most incredible shade of blue I'd ever seen, so clear that I could see fish swimming 20 feet below the surface. Small islands dotted the horizon, each one covered in lush green vegetation that looked like something from a nature documentary. Marcus pointed out landmarks as we traveled, explaining the geography and ecology of the region with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his work. That's Ambergris Cay, he said, indicating a larger island to our north. Very popular with tourists, lots of resorts and dive shops. But your uncle, he preferred the more remote locations where you can hear yourself think. Was he very solitary when he visited the island? Not solitary exactly, but he valued peace and quiet. He'd spend hours reading on the villa's deck, or walking the beaches looking for interesting shells and driftwood. Maria would prepare wonderful meals using fish from the waters around the island and vegetables from her garden, and they'd sit together in the evenings talking about everything from politics to philosophy. Your uncle was a very thoughtful man, always asking questions about local culture and history. The image of Uncle Paul engaging with Maria and Carlos as friends rather than employees aligned perfectly with my memories of his character. He'd always been interested in people's stories, always willing to listen more than talk when conversation turned to personal matters. After about 90 minutes of travel, Marcus pointed ahead to what looked like a small green hill rising from the ocean. There she is, he said with obvious pride. Isla Esperanza. Your island, Miss Emma. As we approached, I could see details that hadn't been visible in the photographs. The island was larger than I'd expected, with several distinct areas connected by what appeared to be well-maintained walking paths. The villa sat prominently on the highest point, its white walls and red roof creating a striking contrast against the tropical vegetation. The dock was longer and more substantial than the pictures had suggested, clearly designed to accommodate boats much larger than the one we were traveling in. But what took my breath away was the sheer beauty of the place. This wasn't just a piece of property or a valuable asset. This was a genuine paradise, the kind of location that existed more often in dreams than in reality. The water surrounding the island was so clear that I could see the sandy bottom, even in areas that appeared to be quite deep. And tropical fish darted between coral formations that created an underwater garden of colors I didn't have names for. Uncle Paul chose well, I murmured, more to myself than to Marcus. He always said the island chose him rather than the other way around, Marcus replied. The first time he saw it, he told me, he knew immediately that he belonged here. Said it felt like coming home to a place he'd never been before. As we tied up at the dock, I could see 2 figures walking down from the villa to greet us. The woman was small and compact, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and a face that radiated warmth even from a distance. The man beside her was taller and broader, with skin weathered by decades of sun and sea, moving with the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in his environment. Maria and Carlos Santos, Marcus said, following my gaze. They've been so excited about your visit that Maria has been cooking for 3 days straight, preparing all of Mr. Paul's favorite dishes in your honor. Maria reached the dock first, and before I could extend my hand for a formal greeting, she'd wrapped me in a hug that felt like being embraced by a favorite grandmother. Miss Emma, she said in accented but clear English, welcome to your island. Mr. Paul, he showed us so many pictures of you, told us so many stories. We feel like you are family already. Carlos shook my hand with calloused palms that spoke of years of physical work, but his smile was gentle, and his eyes held the same warmth I'd heard in Marcus's voice when he talked about Uncle Paul. Mr. Paul was very proud of you, he said simply. He said you understood the important things in life, the things that money cannot buy. As we walked up the winding path from the dock to the villa, Maria kept up a steady stream of commentary about the island's features and history. She pointed out the organic garden where she grew tomatoes, peppers, and tropical fruits. She showed me the small guest cottage where she and Carlos lived, explaining that Uncle Paul had insisted they have complete privacy and autonomy in their living arrangements. She indicated the solar panel array that powered the entire island, the rainwater collection system that supplemented the natural spring, and the communications tower that provided internet and phone service. Mr. Paul, he wanted the island to be completely self-sufficient, Maria explained. He said modern conveniences should enhance natural beauty, not compete with it. Everything here is designed to work with the environment rather than against it. The villa itself was even more stunning than the photographs had suggested. The main living area was open and airy, with floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides that created the feeling of living outdoors while maintaining comfort and protection from weather. The furnishings were simple but elegant, clearly chosen for comfort and durability rather than ostentation. Everything was spotlessly clean and perfectly maintained, evidence of Maria's careful attention to detail. But when Maria led me to the library, I actually gasped out loud. The room was exactly as beautiful as Uncle Paul's photographs had shown, but being physically present among the books and the ocean view created an emotional impact that no picture could have conveyed. This wasn't just a room for storing books. It was a sanctuary for someone who viewed reading as a sacred activity. Mr. Paul spent most of his time here when he visited, Maria said softly. He said books were his favorite traveling companions because they could take him anywhere in the world without requiring passports or packing. I ran my fingers along the spines of the volumes lining the built-in shelves, recognizing many titles that Uncle Paul and I had discussed over the years. Classic literature mixed with contemporary fiction, travel memoirs alongside histories of maritime exploration, philosophical works next to collections of poetry. This was the library of someone who read broadly and thoughtfully, someone who viewed books as windows into different ways of understanding the world. "There's something else Mr. Paul wanted you to see," Carlos said, producing a key from his pocket. A special collection he kept locked away, books he said were too valuable to leave accessible when he wasn't here. He unlocked a cabinet I hadn't noticed, revealing several shelves of books that were clearly very old and very expensive. First editions of classic novels, signed copies of important historical works, rare travel accounts from centuries past. But what made me catch my breath was a handwritten note taped to the inside of the cabinet door. "For Emma, who understands that the greatest treasures are found between the covers of books rather than in the vaults of banks." He added that note just before his last visit, Maria said quietly. He said if anything happened to him, we should make sure you saw this collection and understood that it was meant for you. I stood in that beautiful library, surrounded by Uncle Paul's carefully curated collection of books, looking out at an ocean view that belonged in a travel magazine, and finally understood what he'd been trying to tell me in his letter. This wasn't just about inheriting valuable property. This was about receiving permission to live the kind of life I'd always dreamed of but never believed I deserved. That evening, Maria prepared a dinner that was simultaneously elegant and comforting, featuring fresh fish caught in the waters around the island, vegetables from her garden, and tropical fruits I'd never tasted before. We ate on the villa's main deck as the sun set over the Caribbean, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made the desert sunsets of Arizona seem pale by comparison. Mr. Paul always said that sharing a meal while watching the sunset was the closest thing to heaven that existed on earth, Carlos told me as we lingered over coffee and something Maria called coconut flan, that was possibly the most delicious dessert I'd ever eaten. "Tell me about his visits," I said. "What was he like when he was here?" Maria and Carlos exchanged glances, and I could see them trying to decide how much to share about Uncle Paul's private moments on the island. "He was different here than in his business life," Maria finally said. "More relaxed, more himself. He would wake early to watch the sunrise from the library, spend the mornings reading or walking the beaches. In the afternoons, he liked to help Carlos with maintenance projects around the island, learning to repair solar panels or tend the garden. Evenings were for cooking together and talking about life. He asked many questions about our family, our traditions, our perspective on what makes life meaningful, Carlos added. He said his business success had brought him many things, but it had also created distance between himself and the simple pleasures that had once made him happy. The island was his way of remembering who he was before money complicated everything. Did he ever talk about our family back in Arizona? I asked. Maria hesitated before answering. He loved his family, but he worried that some of them had lost sight of what was truly important. He said there was too much focus on accumulating wealth and status, not enough appreciation for relationships and experiences and simple contentment. He spoke of you differently, Carlos said. He said you reminded him of himself as a young person, curious about the world but not greedy for its material offerings. He worried that your family didn't appreciate your qualities, that they made you feel like your interests were somehow less valuable than their achievements. Hearing Uncle Paul's assessment of our family dynamics was both validating and sad. He'd seen what I'd felt but never been able to articulate, that my love of books and ideas and quiet reflection had been viewed as weaknesses rather than strengths, that my contentment with simple living had been interpreted as lack of ambition rather than conscious choice. Mr. Paul said the island would give you permission to be yourself without apology, Maria said gently. He said you could live here full-time or visit whenever you needed refuge, or simply know that you owned a place in the world where your way of being was not just accepted but celebrated. That night, I lay in Uncle Paul's bed in the villa's master bedroom, listening to the sound of waves against the shore and looking up at stars that were brighter and more numerous than any I'd ever seen in Phoenix. The bedroom windows were open to catch the ocean breeze, and the air smelled like salt and tropical flowers and something indefinable that might have been pure contentment. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was in a place where I truly belonged. Not because of the luxury or the monetary value of the property, but because Uncle Paul had created a space that honored the parts of my personality that the rest of the world had always made me feel defensive about. I spent the next 3 days exploring every inch of the island, learning its rhythms and discovering hidden treasures that Uncle Paul had left for me to find. A secluded cove on the island's north side where sea turtles came to nest. A hill overlooking the reef where Uncle Paul had built a simple bench for watching marine life. A small meditation garden behind the villa where flowering vines created a natural cathedral of green and gold. Maria taught me to prepare local dishes using ingredients from the island's garden and surrounding waters. Carlos showed me how the solar power system worked and how to maintain the rainwater collection cisterns. Both of them shared stories about Uncle Paul's visits, painting a picture of a man who'd found genuine peace and purpose in this remote paradise. But the most meaningful discovery came on my final morning, when I was walking the beach at sunrise and found a message in a bottle wedged between 2 pieces of driftwood. Inside was a letter in Uncle Paul's handwriting, dated just 3 months before his death. Emma, it read, if you're reading this, it means you've come to see the island for yourself, and I hope you've found it as magical as I always have. I've left this letter here because I wanted you to discover it naturally, the way I discovered this island itself. Some gifts are meant to be stumbled upon rather than formally presented. The letter went on to describe his vision for my future, but not in terms of what he thought I should do with the property. Instead, he wrote about his hope that the island would give me confidence to trust my own instincts about what kind of life would make me happy. You've spent too many years apologizing for who you are, he wrote. Your love of solitude, your preference for books over parties, your contentment with simple pleasures, these aren't character flaws that need to be corrected. They're gifts that our culture doesn't value highly enough, but that make you exactly the kind of person who can appreciate what this island offers. Whether you choose to live here permanently, visit occasionally, or sell the property and use the proceeds to create a different kind of life, the decision is entirely yours. My only hope is that owning this place will remind you that you deserve to be happy in whatever way feels authentic to you, regardless of what other people think you should want. I sat on the beach holding that letter as the sun painted the ocean in shades of gold and turquoise, finally understanding the full scope of what Uncle Paul had given me. The island itself was extraordinary, but the real gift was permission to stop apologizing for being different from Ashley and Kevin and everyone else who measured success primarily in financial terms. On the boat ride back to Belize City, Marcus asked about my plans for the property. I'm not sure yet, I admitted. I need to think about what this all means for my life back in Arizona. Mr. Paul always said the island would tell you what it wanted from you, Marcus replied. He believed that some places choose their owners, rather than the other way around. Maybe you just need to give yourself time to listen. The flight back to Phoenix felt like traveling between different universes. In the span of 5 days, I'd gone from being a struggling librarian living paycheck to paycheck to being the owner of a tropical paradise that represented more wealth than I'd ever imagined possessing. But more importantly, I'd experienced what it felt like to live in a place where my natural inclinations were assets rather than eccentricities. Ashley was waiting for me at the airport, looking anxious and exhausted in a way that suggested she'd spent the entire time I was gone worrying about what I might discover in Belize. "Emma, thank God you're back safely," she said, hugging me with what felt like genuine relief. "I've been so worried about you. What did you find? Was any of it real?" I looked at my sister, who'd driven across the city to meet my plane despite our recent conflicts, and realized that her fears about my inheritance weren't entirely selfish. Part of her genuine concern came from love, even if that love was complicated by her own disappointment and confusion about Uncle Paul's choices. "It's all real, Ashley. The island is even more beautiful than the photographs showed, and Uncle Paul really did own it for 15 years. Maria and Carlos Santos are wonderful people who took excellent care of the property and genuinely loved Uncle Paul. The whole situation is exactly what David Collins told us it was." Ashley's face cycled through several emotions as she processed my confirmation that Uncle Paul's bequest was legitimate. Relief that I hadn't been scammed, disappointment that her theories about fraud had been wrong, and something that might have been the beginning of acceptance, that our uncle had made conscious choices about how to distribute his wealth. "So what happens now?" she asked as we walked toward the baggage claim. "Are you planning to move to Belize? Sell the island? What does someone like you do with a property worth millions of dollars?" Someone like you. The phrase stung, but I realized Ashley probably didn't mean it as an insult. She genuinely couldn't imagine how a person with my modest lifestyle and practical concerns could successfully manage such an extraordinary asset. "I'm still figuring that out," I said honestly. "But Ashley, I need you to understand something. Uncle Paul didn't give me this inheritance to make me rich. He gave it to me because he thought I would appreciate what the island represents, not just what it's worth." Ashley was quiet for several minutes as we waited for my luggage. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller and more vulnerable than I'd heard it in years. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did Uncle Paul leave you the island because I disappointed him somehow? Because I focused too much on money and business instead of spending time with him as a person?" The question revealed that beneath Ashley's anger and jealousy was genuine hurt about Uncle Paul's assessment of her character. She was struggling with the possibility that her efforts to be successful and responsible had somehow failed to earn his respect and affection. "Ashley, Uncle Paul loved you. He left you a substantial inheritance that shows he valued your practical skills and wanted to ensure your family's security. But yes, I think he also worried that your focus on financial success sometimes prevented you from appreciating other kinds of value." "Like what?" "Like relationships that aren't transactional. Like experiences that can't be monetized. Like the simple pleasure of reading a good book or watching a sunset without thinking about whether the time could be spent more productively." Ashley nodded slowly, and I could see her trying to understand a perspective that was fundamentally foreign to her worldview. "Emma, can I ask you a favor? If you decide to keep the island, would you consider letting me visit sometime? Not to interfere with your decisions about the property, just to see what Uncle Paul loved about it. I feel like I missed knowing an important part of who he was, and maybe understanding his passion for this place would help me understand him better." The request surprised me, both because it suggested genuine curiosity rather than hidden agenda, and because it represented the first time Ashley had ever asked to share something I possessed rather than assuming she was entitled to it. "Of course you can visit," I said. "Uncle Paul would want his family to see what he created there, even if he couldn't share it with us while he was alive." As we drove through the familiar streets of Phoenix toward my apartment, I realized that Uncle Paul's gift was already changing my relationships in ways that went beyond financial implications. For the first time in our adult lives, Ashley was asking rather than demanding, acknowledging that I had something valuable to offer rather than assuming she knew what was best for everyone involved. The island had given me more than property and security. It had given me confidence to set boundaries and expect respect, to believe that my perspective and preferences had value even when they differed from other people's expectations. Back in my small apartment, surrounded by my modest possessions and simple furnishings, I spread the island documentation across my kitchen table one more time. But now, instead of feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of my inheritance, I felt empowered by the choices it represented. I could sell the island and use the proceeds to create a more conventional kind of security for myself. I could keep it as a vacation retreat, visiting occasionally while maintaining my life in Arizona. Or I could embrace Uncle Paul's vision completely and make Isla Esperanza my primary home, living the kind of life that honored my authentic interests and inclinations rather than others' expectations about what success should look like. For the first time since the will reading, I wasn't afraid of making the wrong choice. Uncle Paul had given me not just an inheritance, but permission to trust my own judgment about what would make me happy. Whatever I decided, I knew it would be my decision, made for my own reasons, without apology or compromise. 6 months after Uncle Paul's will reading, I was sitting in the Phoenix Public Library during my lunch break when my phone buzzed with a text from Ashley that would change everything between us forever. "Emma, I need to tell you something important. Can we meet after work today? It's about the island and some things I discovered about Uncle Paul's business records." The message carried an urgency that made my stomach tighten with anxiety. Ashley and I had maintained an uneasy peace since my return from Belize, with her making genuine efforts to understand my perspective while I tried to be patient with her ongoing struggle to accept Uncle Paul's choices. But there was something in the tone of this text that suggested whatever she'd discovered would upset the delicate balance we'd achieved. I'd spent the past 6 months making gradual changes to my life that reflected my new financial security without completely abandoning the routines and relationships that grounded me. I'd reduced my hours at the library to part-time, allowing me to pursue projects that felt more personally meaningful while still maintaining the work I genuinely enjoyed. I'd moved to a larger apartment with better light for reading, and a small balcony where I could grow herbs and flowers. Most significantly, I'd returned to Isla Esperanza twice more, each visit deepening my appreciation for Uncle Paul's vision and my understanding of what the island could offer. During my second visit in March, I'd spent 2 weeks working with Maria to catalog Uncle Paul's book collection and organize the library in a way that would make it accessible to future guests. We'd also begun planning improvements to the guest cottage that would allow the island to accommodate visitors who shared Uncle Paul's love of reading and natural beauty. The idea was slowly forming that I might transform Isla Esperanza into a writer's retreat, a place where authors and scholars could find the kind of peaceful environment that seemed increasingly rare in our connected world. My third visit in May had been even more transformative. I'd brought my laptop and spent 10 days writing a detailed proposal for converting the island into a non-profit literary sanctuary, complete with residency programs for emerging writers and workshops for students interested in environmental literature. The project excited me more than anything I'd ever contemplated, combining my love of books with meaningful work that would honor Uncle Paul's memory while creating something genuinely valuable for the literary community. But Ashley's text suggested that my careful planning might be premature. Had she discovered some legal complication that would affect my ownership of the island? Had Uncle Paul's business affairs been more complex than anyone realized, creating obligations that would compromise my inheritance? We met at a coffee shop near Ashley's real estate office, a trendy place with exposed brick walls and expensive espresso drinks that felt like neutral territory for a conversation that might become difficult. Ashley arrived looking unusually serious, carrying a manila folder that she placed on the table between us with the careful precision of someone handling evidence. "Emma, I owe you an apology," she began, which was not what I'd expected to hear. "I've been investigating Uncle Paul's business records and financial history, partly because I was still hoping to find some way to challenge his will, but mostly because I couldn't understand how he'd managed to hide such a significant asset from everyone who thought they knew him well." Ashley opened the folder and withdrew several documents that appeared to be financial statements and business correspondence spanning many years. What I found wasn't evidence of deception or financial irregularity. What I found was proof that Uncle Paul was an even more remarkable person than any of us realized, and that his decision to leave you the island was part of a much larger pattern of generosity that our family never knew about. She handed me a stack of canceled checks and wire transfer records dating back 15 years, each one representing a significant charitable donation to organizations supporting education, environmental conservation, and literacy programs throughout Central America. The amounts were staggering, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, money that Uncle Paul had quietly given away without seeking recognition or tax benefits. He was funding scholarship programs for students in Belize and Guatemala, Ashley explained, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and regret. He was supporting marine conservation efforts throughout the Caribbean. He was paying for library construction in rural communities that had no access to books or educational resources. The evidence painted a picture of Uncle Paul as someone who'd used his business success not just to secure his own comfort, but to address problems that deeply concerned him. The island wasn't an indulgence or status symbol. It was his operational base for philanthropic work that he'd kept completely private. There's more, Ashley continued, producing another set of documents. I found correspondence between Uncle Paul and Marcus at the property management company that shows they weren't just maintaining Isla Esperanza as a private retreat. They were using it as a training center for sustainable living practices, hosting workshops for local families about solar power installation and rainwater harvesting and organic farming techniques. The revelation explained why Marcus and Maria and Carlos had all spoken of Uncle Paul with such genuine affection and respect. He hadn't just been a wealthy American who'd bought their services. He'd been a partner in work that was improving their community and preserving their environment. Emma, I need you to understand what this means, Ashley said, leaning forward with an intensity I'd rarely seen from her. Uncle Paul didn't leave you a vacation home or a valuable asset to sell for profit. He left you the headquarters of a charitable operation that was changing people's lives. The island isn't just your inheritance, it's your responsibility. The weight of Ashley's discovery settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd fallen in love with Isla Esperanza because of its beauty and tranquility, because it represented freedom from the pressures and expectations that had always made me feel inadequate. But Uncle Paul's vision had been much larger than personal refuge. He'd seen the island as a place where resources and knowledge could be shared, where his success could be transformed into opportunities for others. Did you find any indication of what he expected me to do with this information? I asked. Ashley pulled out one final document, a letter addressed to me in Uncle Paul's handwriting, dated just weeks before his death. He left this with his attorney, with instructions that it should only be given to you if you chose to keep the island rather than selling it immediately. I opened the envelope with trembling hands, recognizing Uncle Paul's familiar script covering several pages of personal stationery. My dear Emma, the letter began, if you're reading this, it means you've discovered the full scope of what Isla Esperanza represents, and I hope you're not feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility I'm placing on your shoulders. The letter went on to explain Uncle Paul's philosophy about wealth and obligation, his belief that success created duties, as well as privileges. He'd chosen me as his heir not just because I appreciated the island's beauty, but because he believed I had the character to understand and continue his work. You've always been interested in education and literacy, always concerned about fairness and justice, even when those concerns weren't popular with our family, he wrote. The island gave me a platform to turn my business profits into meaningful change, and I believe it can do the same for you, though in ways that reflect your own interests and capabilities rather than simply continuing my specific projects. Uncle Paul's letter included detailed information about the charitable programs he'd been funding, along with contact information for the organizations and individuals who'd been implementing his vision throughout Central America. But he was careful to emphasize that I shouldn't feel obligated to continue his exact approach. The island's real value isn't in its market price or even in the specific work I've been doing there, he wrote. Its value is in providing a place where someone with good intentions and adequate resources can make a genuine difference in the world. How you choose to use that opportunity is entirely up to you, but I hope you'll use it for something larger than personal comfort. I finished reading the letter in silence, aware that Ashley was watching my face for reactions that would indicate how I was processing this new understanding of my inheritance. When I finally looked up, her expression was expectant but also nervous, as if she was afraid of how I might respond to having my simple island paradise transformed into a complex moral obligation. "Ashley, why are you showing me this now? You could have kept Uncle Paul's charitable work secret. Let me continue thinking the island was just a beautiful retreat that I could enjoy without complications." Ashley was quiet for a long moment, staring at her coffee cup while she formulated her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer and more vulnerable than I'd heard in years. Because I realized that my anger about Uncle Paul's will wasn't really about money or fairness. It was about feeling like he'd judged me and found me lacking, like he'd decided I was too selfish or materialistic to be trusted with something important. She looked directly at me for the first time since we'd sat down. But discovering his charitable work made me understand that Uncle Paul wasn't making judgments about our character. He was making practical decisions about who could best continue work that mattered deeply to him. And Emma, as much as it hurts my pride to admit this, he was right to choose you. Ashley's acknowledgement represented such a fundamental shift in our relationship dynamic that I found myself unable to respond immediately. For our entire adult lives, she'd positioned herself as the more capable sister, the one who understood how the world worked and made smart decisions about practical matters. But Uncle Paul's bequest had forced her to confront the possibility that success and capability could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with financial achievement or social status. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," Ashley continued, "and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. I could never do what Uncle Paul was doing with the island, even if I had inherited it instead of you. I don't have the patience for educational work, or the interest in environmental conservation. I would have seen the island as a valuable asset to be maximized rather than a tool for creating positive change." The honesty in Ashley's admission was both painful and liberating. She was acknowledging that Uncle Paul's assessment of our different characters had been accurate, that his decision to leave me the island reflected genuine insight into who we were rather than arbitrary favoritism. But Emma, I also realized something else. Just because Uncle Paul chose you to inherit his work doesn't mean you have to do it alone. I may not have your vision or your values, but I do have skills that could be useful if you decide to expand the island's charitable programs. Ashley reached into her folder and withdrew what appeared to be a detailed business plan, complete with financial projections and organizational charts. "I've been researching nonprofit management and fundraising strategies. If you want to transform Isla Esperanza into a formal charitable foundation, I could help you navigate the legal requirements and establish sustainable funding sources. You'd make the decisions about programs and priorities, but I could handle the administrative and financial management that you'd probably find tedious and stressful." The offer was so unexpected and generous that I felt tears starting to form in my eyes. Ashley was essentially proposing to support my work rather than competing with it, to use her business skills in service of my vision rather than pursuing her own independent goals. "Ashley, are you sure about this? Working together on something this important could change our relationship in ways we can't predict." "Emma, our relationship has already changed. Uncle Paul's will forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself and my priorities. I've been so focused on accumulating wealth and status that I lost sight of what those things are supposed to enable. Money and success are only valuable if they allow you to do something meaningful with your life." Ashley's words reminded me of conversations I'd had with Uncle Paul years earlier, when he'd talked about the responsibility that came with financial success and his concern that too many wealthy people became obsessed with accumulating more rather than using what they had wisely. "Working with you on Uncle Paul's charitable programs would give me a chance to be part of something larger than my own financial advancement," Ashley continued. "And honestly, I think it would make me a better person, more like the kind of person Uncle Paul was, and less like the kind of person who mistakes net worth for self-worth." Over the following weeks, Ashley and I spent hours discussing how we might transform Uncle Paul's informal charitable work into a structured foundation that could continue his legacy, while expanding into new areas that reflected my own interests and expertise. The conversations revealed aspects of Ashley's character that had been hidden beneath her focus on material success, including a genuine desire to make a positive difference in the world, and a sophisticated understanding of how charitable organizations could be structured for maximum effectiveness. We decided to establish the Paul Rodriguez Foundation for Literary and Environmental Education, with Isla Esperanza serving as both headquarters and program site. The foundation would offer writers' residencies for authors working on environmental themes, provide scholarships for students pursuing studies in conservation or sustainable development, and support literacy programs in communities throughout Central America. Ashley handled the complex legal and financial requirements for establishing the foundation, working with attorneys and accountants to ensure that our programs would be properly structured and adequately funded. I focused on developing relationships with universities, literary organizations, and environmental groups that could help us identify qualified participants and measure the impact of our work. The process of creating something meaningful together revealed strengths in both of us that had been obscured by years of sibling rivalry and competition. Ashley's business acumen, which I'd always experienced as intimidating, became an asset that allowed us to turn idealistic goals into practical programs. My knowledge of education and literature, which Ashley had often dismissed as impractical, provided the foundation for programs that could genuinely improve people's lives. 9 months after Uncle Paul's death, we held the Paul Rodriguez Foundation's inaugural ceremony on Isla Esperanza, with Maria and Carlos serving as hosts for a gathering that included representatives from universities, environmental organizations, and literary societies throughout the Americas. The event was small and focused, reflecting Uncle Paul's preference for meaningful work over public recognition, but it marked the beginning of something that we hoped would honor his memory while creating new opportunities for education and conservation. During the ceremony, I stood in Uncle Paul's library looking out at the Caribbean waters that had inspired his vision, surrounded by people who shared his commitment to using resources and knowledge for the benefit of others. Ashley was across the room talking with potential scholarship recipients, her enthusiasm for their projects genuine and infectious. Maria was preparing a feast using ingredients from the island's garden, continuing the tradition of hospitality that had made Uncle Paul's visits so meaningful. But the moment that affected me most deeply came when a young woman from Guatemala approached me to express her gratitude for the scholarship that would allow her to pursue graduate studies in environmental science. "Mr. Paul's foundation is giving me opportunities that would never have existed in my community," she said. "But more than that, it's showing me that education and conservation can be connected, that studying the environment can be a way of protecting the places and people I love." Her words reminded me of something Uncle Paul had written in one of his letters about the true value of education lying not in personal advancement but in the capacity to solve problems that affect entire communities. Through his foundation, we were creating opportunities for people to develop knowledge and skills that could benefit their families and neighbors for generations. That evening, as the ceremony participants gathered on the villa's deck to watch the sun set over the Caribbean, Ashley and I found ourselves standing together at the railing, looking out at the ocean that had captured Uncle Paul's imagination and redirected the course of both our lives. "Emma, can I ask you something?" Ashley said quietly. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Uncle Paul had left the island to me instead of you?" I considered her question seriously, thinking about the different paths our lives might have taken if Uncle Paul had made different assumptions about our characters and capabilities. "I think you would have done something impressive with it," I said honestly. "Maybe not the same thing I'm doing, but something that reflected your own strengths and interests. You might have developed it into an eco-resort, or a conference center, or some other kind of business that created jobs and economic opportunities." Ashley nodded thoughtfully. "But I don't think I would have understood what Uncle Paul was really trying to accomplish with his charitable work. I would have seen the financial aspects, but I wouldn't have grasped the educational and environmental connections that make the programs meaningful. And I probably wouldn't have been able to create a sustainable organizational structure without your help," I replied. Uncle Paul was wise to choose me as his heir. But maybe he also knew that eventually I'd need your skills to turn his vision into reality. As we watched the sun disappear into the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost impossible in their beauty, I realized that Uncle Paul's greatest gift hadn't been the island itself, or even the financial security it represented. His greatest gift had been forcing Ashley and me to discover that our different strengths could complement each other rather than competing, that we could accomplish more together than either of us could achieve alone. The Foundation's work grew steadily over the following years, expanding from our initial programs to include marine conservation projects, sustainable agriculture training, and educational exchanges that brought students from throughout the Americas to study environmental issues in the unique laboratory that Isla Esperanza provided. Ashley's prediction that working together would change our relationship proved accurate, but the changes were entirely positive, strengthening bonds that had been strained by years of competition and misunderstanding. Uncle Paul's Island became the place where both of us learned to appreciate qualities in each other that we'd previously overlooked or undervalued. Ashley discovered that my love of books and ideas could be translated into programs that had real-world impact, while I learned that her business skills could be used for purposes much more meaningful than personal enrichment. But perhaps most importantly, the island taught us both that wealth and success are only valuable when they're used to create opportunities for others, that the greatest satisfaction comes not from accumulating resources but from using them wisely in service of something larger than personal comfort or status. 3 years after the will reading that had initially seemed like such a devastating humiliation, Ashley and I were working side by side in Uncle Paul's library, preparing for the Foundation's annual report that would document the scholarships we'd awarded, the conservation projects we'd supported, and the literary programs we'd established. The work was demanding and sometimes frustrating, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that neither of us had experienced in our previous careers. "Emma," Ashley said as we reviewed applications for the coming year's writers' residencies, "I need to tell you something I've never said before. I'm proud of you. Not just because of what you've accomplished with the Foundation, but because of who you are. Uncle Paul saw something in you that the rest of us missed, and I'm grateful that he was wise enough to give you the chance to show us all what you were capable of." Ashley's words represented the final piece of healing that Uncle Paul's gift had made possible. The sister who had once dismissed my interests as impractical now celebrated my work as meaningful. The family dynamics that had made me feel like a perpetual outsider had been transformed into a partnership that honored both our contributions. That evening, as I walked the beaches of Isla Esperanza watching the stars emerge in the Caribbean sky, I thought about the path that had led me from feeling like the family disappointment to becoming the steward of Uncle Paul's legacy. The journey had required me to expand my understanding of what I was capable of, to accept responsibility for work that was larger and more complex than anything I'd previously attempted. But it had also taught me that Uncle Paul's assessment of my character had been more accurate than my own. He'd seen potential in me that I hadn't recognized, capabilities that had been hidden beneath years of self-doubt and defensive humility. The island hadn't just given me financial security or professional satisfaction. It had given me permission to become the person I was meant to be. Standing on the dock where I'd first arrived 3 years earlier, looking back at the villa where Uncle Paul had dreamed his dreams and planned his charitable work, I finally understood the full meaning of his bequest. The dollar bill that Ashley had mocked at the will reading had indeed been symbolic, but not in the way any of us had initially assumed. It hadn't represented my worth to Uncle Paul. It had represented the conventional thinking about value that he wanted me to transcend. The island wasn't just property, or even just a tool for charitable work. It was proof that the most important gifts can't be measured in traditional financial terms, that true wealth lies in having work that matters, and relationships that support growth and change and mutual appreciation. Uncle Paul had given me more than a private island worth millions of dollars. He'd given me a life worth living, work worth doing, and the knowledge that kindness and authenticity are ultimately more valuable than any amount of money or status. Most importantly, he'd given me the confidence to trust my own judgment about what would make me happy, regardless of what other people thought I should want. As I walked back toward the villa, where Ashley was probably still working on Foundation correspondence, and Maria was preparing tomorrow's meals, I realized that Uncle Paul's greatest achievement hadn't been building a successful shipping business, or even establishing charitable programs that helped hundreds of people throughout Central America. His greatest achievement had been seeing clearly enough through family dynamics and cultural expectations to recognize what each of us needed most, and having the wisdom and courage to provide exactly that. The will reading that had begun with such humiliation and ended with such vindication had been just the first chapter of a story that was still being written. A story about the power of unexpected gifts to transform not just individual lives, but entire families, Uncle Paul's Island had become the place where Ashley and I finally learned to appreciate each other, where we discovered that our different strengths could create something more valuable than either of us could accomplish alone. And in the end, that understanding proved to be worth far more than the $2.8 million that the island had cost, more valuable than any amount of money or property or conventional measures of success. Uncle Paul had given us each exactly what we needed most. Me, the confidence to trust my own vision, and Ashley, the opportunity to use her skills for something larger than personal advancement. The Foundation's work would continue growing and evolving, but its core mission would always reflect the lesson Uncle Paul had tried to teach us through his carefully planned bequest. True success isn't measured by what you accumulate for yourself, but by what you make possible for others. Real wealth lies not in having more than other people, but in using whatever you have to create opportunities for education, conservation, and human connection. As I settled into bed in the villa's master bedroom, listening to the familiar sound of waves against the shore and looking up at stars that seemed brighter and more hopeful than any I'd seen in Arizona, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for Uncle Paul's wisdom and generosity. He'd given me more than I'd ever dared to dream of, and in return, I dedicated my life to ensuring that his vision would continue benefiting others for generations to come. The dollar bill that had once seemed like such a cruel joke was now framed and hanging in the Foundation's office, serving as a reminder that the most valuable gifts often come disguised as something ordinary, that true worth can't be measured by conventional standards, and that sometimes the people who love us most see possibilities in us that we haven't yet learned to see in ourselves. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.